All right. Well, Andrew, it's a pleasure to interview you and to congratulate you on your wonderful new book, Singled Out: The True Story of Glenn Burke. And I must say, you have excellent taste in subject matters. Um, for our viewers, I co-authored Glenn Burke's autobiography back in 1995. So this is really kind of a cool interview. One author interviewing another about a subject, in this case, Glenn Burke, that they both wrote books about. So Andrew, first of all, I've really been looking forward to this interview. What interested you in taking a deeper dive into Glenn Burke's life with your book?
Well, first of all, Erik, thank you for interviewing me about this book. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to talk to you and to see you again. Interviewing you for the book was one of my favorite parts of that whole experience, and you were so kind to share audio transcripts and letters and documents that you had collected either before or even after your book came out. And so I just really appreciate that very, very much.
Well,
So I'm
pleasure.
interested, yeah, I mean, that was really so generous. I'm interested in writing books about sports and history and social justice. So my first book, Strong Inside, was a biography of Perry Wallace, who was the first Black basketball player in the SEC. And it was as much about the civil rights movement and what it was like to be a Black teenager in Nashville and playing throughout the South as it was about basketball. And then my second book, Games of Deception, was about the first U.S. Olympic men's basketball team at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. And that one was about anti-Semitism and fascism and the value of the truth, as much as it was about basketball. So I was looking for another story that would involve sports, and baseball is my favorite sport, and I hadn't written about baseball yet, but also had an important social justice angle to it, and my books are marketed towards and largely intended for teenagers. And I felt like a story of the first gay baseball player would be especially appealing to high school students, as well as adults, and I hope that if you've read the book, I think it'll appeal as much to adults as to kids. But I love going into schools and telling these stories that involve sports, but are about something more also. I think there's a lot of kids that don't necessarily know that they might like to read yet, but they watch games on TV, or they love to play sports, or they play video games that are related to sports. And so there's a picture of a baseball player or a basketball player on the cover of the book, they might be more likely to pick it up and then become a lifelong reader. And I think that young people are in some ways more interested or more excited about reading a book about a gay character, even than some adults. And so I thought the time was right to introduce this story to a new generation. Your book with Glenn came out in the mid-90s, and maybe now is time for another story about Glenn.
Well, you that's a perfect entree into my next question. Your book deals far more than just about Glenn Burke. It deals with social progress related to gay men and women. You even include a detailed listing of the U.S. gay rights timeline in your book. As you know, in President Obama's first term, he was opposed to gay marriage. Barack Obama, of all people, but then came around, and as have a great percentage of Americans in the last 6 or 7 years on gay rights. What do you attribute this evolution in thinking to?
Well, I think part of it is something that Glenn had in mind. I know when you sat with him on his deathbed, he told you that he hoped that his experience would make life easier for other people in the future. And I think there's been a lot of people who have had that same type of courage as Glenn to come out and to share their story. And just by the fact of people recognizing that there are actually gay people all around them in their lives, a lot of times that takes place within a family. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. But just in pop culture, the number of actors, singers, politicians, even who have come out and been courageous in telling their story, I think it's had a cumulative effect on people from all walks of life. And so I think that usually it involves some sort of personal connection, I think, in most cases, to change someone's heart. And so my hope would be that with this book, that there are kids who are, already ready for this story, that enjoy it, but also maybe some readers who maybe haven't thought about what it's like to be gay in America, or what it was like for a gay Black man in the 70s and 80s, to have his career ripped away from him, because of who he was, or to have this terrible disease of HIV/AIDS that wasn't addressed as quickly enough because some people thought that the only people getting it deserved to get it, because of who they were. And so maybe it will create that empathy that does lead to those changes that you're talking about.
Well, you write about Glenn's sister, Lutha, a great deal in the book. And so I've known Lutha since '94, and we still talk and text today. And she's one of my favorite people in the world. Can you talk a little bit about the influence she played in Glenn's life?
Yes, and I remember when you shared Lutha's number with me for the book, you told me, she's terrific, she's an angel, and that was my experience as well in interviewing Lutha a handful of times, and also just texting her random questions here and there as I was working on the book. And her influence on Glenn's life was profound, especially toward the end of his life when Glenn spent his last months living with Lutha, and she nursed him every day, even as she was working long hours herself at a hotel, providing for her family. Her work really never stopped in terms of cooking for Glenn, sitting there rubbing his feet when he was in tremendous pain, staying up all night, just comforting him by telling stories or singing together. And you could just imagine how much that meant to Glenn to have his sister loving him by his side during this period where he's scared, and knows he's dying. And Lutha is right there for him. And I think that there were some people in Glenn's life that kept a distance, in those last months and years of his life. But Lutha was as tight as she could be with him, and what a profound influence she had.
Well, I must tell you how touched I was, how you weave the story of the book that I wrote with Glenn, out at home, into your book, Singled Out. A lot of authors wouldn't have incorporated my story with Glenn into their own book. When did you make that decision to go that route? Was it before or after we met?
I was thinking about it before we met, but it was just solidified when we did our interview. But I just thought, how cool was it? And for those who don't know, I mean, your story is that you used to love to go to Yankees and Mets games with your dad growing up, and you would always show up at the stadium early to get autographs from players. And there was a game, Oakland A's against the Yankees, that you were there early, and the one player who signed an autograph for you was Glenn Burke when you were just a middle schooler, and I thought, I'm an audience for my book is also kids. And I think that they will relate to that story of wanting an autograph from a major league player. And then how cool is it that that stays in your mind, that this is an autograph that you have. And so when you read the Inside Sports article in 1982 about the fact that there was this gay player on the Dodgers, you remember, oh, that's Glenn Burke, whose autograph I have. And then later, when you're an adult and you read in the newspaper that Glenn Burke is dying of AIDS, that you basically stop everything that's going on in your life to go tell this man's story before it's too late. And I thought that was so admirable. And the fact that it goes back to an experience you had as a teenager would be a really nice story for other teens to see, and to think about who are the people around them that are making a difference in their life right now. And the fact that they might have a chance to tell that person's story someday, I think is just really inspiring, and sort of just apart from the inspiration, just sort of a cool full circle type of story, and here you are, written so many books about baseball, and in some ways you could trace it back to that moment at Yankee Stadium. I just thought that was too good not to write about.
Well, that's one of the things I loved about Singled Out, and it's such a wonderful book. It took me literally just a weekend to read the whole thing. It goes in different directions, and you just did a terrific job with that.
Thank you.
So I'm going to read this just so I get it right.
All right.
Dodgers coach Jim Gilliam said Glenn could be the next Willie Mays. Davey Lopes said he had unlimited talent. So when I would make the argument over the years to people, that Glenn Burke was a five-tool player and was robbed of a great major league career or potential, great major league career because he was blackballed from baseball for being gay, critics have always looked at me and have said, his lifetime average was pretty modest. And they would disagree with me. What are your thoughts on Glenn's lifetime statistics versus perhaps the player he could have been had he been a heterosexual?
Right, and I think I've started to pick up some of that same criticism, that you've been dealing with, or people trying to take shots at Glenn and say the only reason anyone cared about him or cares about him, is because he was a gay baseball player, and the trivia to him inventing the high five or something. But if you look at his minor league statistics, and of course, as a baseball fan, I totally understand there have been great minor leaguers that have never panned out in the majors. There's plenty of players that people said had great potential and that just didn't happen. But first, I think you have to start and just look at his body of work, right? Like, he hit over 305 times in the minor leagues. He set stolen base records in, I think, 2 or 3 different minor leagues, as he was coming up through the system. He was a good enough athlete to also play college basketball and to get looks from NBA teams that were interested in signing him. So he wasn't just an average athlete. He was an extraordinary athlete. Junior Gilliam, had played with the best, and he recognized that this guy could be a next Willie Mays, like you said. So he was a great defensive player without a doubt already in the major leagues. Dusty Baker told me that he got a jump on a ball in the outfield better than anybody he had seen. He had a tremendously strong arm. He had power as a young player, and in high school and college and coming up through the minors, as well as, as a speedy player. I think at that time in the major leagues, there was room, even if he never developed as a power hitter or more than a 250 to 270 hitter. Back then, there was room for a great defensive outfielder who stole bases. There are plenty of major leaguers like that back in the 70s. But the most important thing is that we don't know what type of player he might have become because he never got that chance. So he had only been with the Dodgers for 2 years, essentially, and had started in game 1 of the World Series, which is Tommy Lasorda's first game he ever manages in the World Series. He has confidence to put a rookie in center field at Yankee Stadium. That says a lot about the type of player that Glenn Burke was. That was a loaded veteran outfield. It wasn't the easiest outfield to break into with Baker and Smith and Monday, right? Even when he goes to the Oakland A's, that's a stacked outfield that he's competing with there. And what a lot of people told me is, baseball being such a mental game, it's hard enough if you don't have anything else on your mind. But imagine that you're constantly having to look over your shoulder, wondering if people are going to figure out who you really are, that you can't share your innermost thoughts even with your teammates because you're not sure what the reaction might be. Dusty Baker talked about the tight fraternity of black ball players back then, whether they were on the same team or even on other teams, and how they would have meals together and commiserate with each other about life. And Glenn couldn't even fully participate in that, because there was so much going on in his life that he just couldn't talk about. As people start to pick up on the fact that he's gay, you have to wonder if coaches or managers, certainly Tommy Lasorda, probably weren't investing their full selves into Glenn's progress the way they might have with other players, because they didn't like the fact that he was even around. When Billy Martin takes over the A's, he tells people he's not going to let Glenn, quote unquote, contaminate his team, and he's not going to have an F word, on his team. So how can you fault Glenn for not being the full ball player he could have been with the Oakland A's when everything's stacked against him? And so that's the argument I would make is not, certainly there's some of this that is just on Glenn as a ball player, but there's a whole lot more of it that is on the surrounding environment that would not allow him to blossom as the player he could have been.
Well, you brought up Dusty Baker, and of course, he was probably Glenn's best friend on the team, almost like an older brother type of figure, as Dusty has been to really a generation of ball players, and now he's been a terrific manager, and now he's taken on almost like a fatherly figure to ball players. You also mentioned Tommy Lasorda. Now, can you talk a little bit about the on again, off again relationship that they had? Because even though that relationship soured at the end, it wasn't always like that, was it?
Right. I think when Glenn first came up with the Dodgers, he liked Tommy Lasorda. From everything that I've read and heard from other people, is Glenn was a funny guy, right? He was a character in the clubhouse. The players loved having him around. Lasorda, for all of his faults, was also a big character, so they had that in common. Glenn used to make fun of Lasorda, even from his earliest days with the team, stuffing a pillow under his jersey, waddling around like him, or barging into his office to get some of the food that Lasorda always had laying around. And so there was kind of a playful relationship almost between them at the beginning. I think that relationship soured the more that Lasorda learned that Glenn was friends with his son, Tommy Jr., who was also gay, which was something that Lasorda never publicly acknowledged, even after Spunky Lasorda died of AIDS, and Tommy, would not acknowledge that was the cause of death. And so, again, in the playoffs in 1977, Glenn starts twice against the Phillies in the NLCS, and sports writers are asking Lasorda, why are you starting this rookie? And he pulls out a notebook and points to Glenn's statistics against Steve Carlton that year. So there was a point in 77 where it was basically all business, and Lasorda respected Glenn as a player. It was after that 77 season that Lasorda and Al Campanis, come to Glenn and basically tell him, you're not going to be on our team unless you get married to a woman and cover up the fact that you're gay. And all of a sudden you start to see articles in spring training where Lasorda and Campanis are knocking Glenn as a ball player. They're not coming out and saying anything about what's really going on behind the scenes, but they're very publicly mounting a campaign against Glenn as a ball player. And there's headlines that say his days are numbered. This is after he had just started in the World Series, and early in the 78 season, he's traded to the A's.
Well, it's always stricken me as odd that Lasorda, as someone who is as much a part of the Hollywood fabric as anybody, wouldn't have been more comfortable with his own son's homosexuality, and not to mention Glenn's. Did that surprise you as well?
Oh, I don't know if it surprised me. I was thinking of Lasorda from sort of just the old school family in Philadelphia, the generation that he came up in. I think that there were a lot of families at that period in history that were kicking their gay sons and daughters out of the house, by the thousands, and those sons and daughters moving to places like San Francisco or New York or Atlanta, where they could be more comfortable with who they were. One of the things that surprised me was actually that there did seem to be a maintained relationship between Tommy and Spunky, even after people were pretty clear that Spunky was gay, and he's dressing as a woman even, and stories sort of out there that that they still had dinner every Sunday night, when the Dodgers were in town, that he would still bring his son around the team on road trips to spring training. And so it was a complicated relationship because, and some people would characterize it as a loving relationship between Tommy and his son. And in some ways it was, and it was certainly more loving than was happening in a lot of families. But how loving and true was the relationship if he wouldn't even acknowledge this central part of his son's identity?
Well, so Glenn gets traded to Oakland in '78, as you mentioned. It was fairly early in the season. One would have thought this would have given Burke a golden opportunity to shine. In fact, Lasorda himself even said that. He says, he's walking around like a tiger, like a caged animal, and he's always complaining and giving me dirty looks about not getting more playing time. Well, now he's going to get it because he goes to the Oakland A's, who were so bad that the sports writers would call them the Oakland Triple A's after the minor league league. So, but it didn't really turn out that well for Glenn in Oakland, did it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I wrote in the book that joining the Oakland A's at that point was like getting on the Titanic as it was sinking. It was a team that was in disarray. Charlie Finley trying to sell the team, barely paying any attention to it. They didn't care if any fans showed up. There was one game where less than 500 people even showed up for the game. And so I think one piece of the puzzle is that here you're going from the Dodgers, one of the most traditional, well-run franchises in baseball that was competing for a World Series championship, to the A's, which you said were more like a minor league team. I think that just wasn't as interesting, for Glenn. He also dealt with injuries that first season that he arrives there, and the next season as well. A crowded outfield. Again, he hadn't come up with these guys through the minor leagues either. I think that had a big part to do with the sense of exclusion that he started to feel with the A's also, even more so than he felt with the Dodgers, was the lack of support he got from a big segment of his A's teammates. There were great friends like Mike Norris, who I interviewed for the book. But I think that, Glenn himself said he started to feel uncomfortable in a lot of ways with the A's as they figured out that he was gay. And what a selfless person he was in some ways, that he felt bad that they were uncomfortable. He felt bad about their homophobia, in a way. He saw them putting on towels, in the clubhouse in situations where they normally just would have been walking around going to the shower, or saying things about him. And he felt that was preventing them from some cohesion on the team, and chooses to step away and leave the A's, comes back in spring training the next year. But, you have to remember also that baseball season wasn't Glenn's entire year. So every offseason, he's going back to the Castro, where he can be himself, and he's surrounded by people that support him, where he's not having to look over his shoulder. And then he re-enters this environment in spring training through a baseball season that is 180 degrees different, and I think that he starts to wonder, is this even worth it? When there's fans in his own outfield at the Coliseum that are heckling him, and thanks to you, Erik, for sharing a letter you got from Bobby Glasser after your book came out about a scene that he experienced as a young fan at the Oakland Coliseum, where A's fans are harassing Glenn with slurs, in this empty arena stadium where everybody can hear it. And I think Glenn just got fed up with that, didn't want to have to deal with that anymore.
Well, before he hung it up, there was one last bastion of hope. Billy Martin came in to manage the A's in 1980, and you would have thought that it would have been a match made in heaven. I mean, these were two tough guys from basically the same neighborhood, Berkeley, California, but it didn't turn out that way. What happened, Andrew?
Yeah, so Glenn had left the team the year before, and when he finds out Billy Martin's going to be the manager, he gives it a shot. In 1980, he comes back to spring training. Like you said, they both had gone to Berkeley High School. Glenn was quoted in the paper saying, he loved it that Billy Martin was kind of a scrapper, a fighter type guy, just like he was. And so he did think this was his chance. He was going to give baseball another shot. But almost immediately in spring training, Billy Martin calls Glenn F word in front of the other players and says he's at the Pink Pony, surrounded by other sports writers in spring training, is when he said he's not going to let a gay player contaminate his team, And so Mike Norris told me a story that Billy Martin was so just his brain clouded by this notion of having Glenn on the team that he pulled Derek Bryant out of his spring training game, thinking it was Glenn in the outfield. And he said, I'm not going to have that gay player out on the field, and pulls another guy off. It wasn't even Glenn. And Derek Bryant never even got another shot with the A's that year and never played in the major leagues again. So you can just see how was whipped into this frenzy just about who Glenn Burke was. So he sent down to the minor leagues to Ogden, which is poetic in some ways. That's where he began his career. His first team in the Dodgers system, had switched franchises. It's with the A's now in 1980. He's down there for a couple months with Shooty Babbitt, among other players, who I interviewed for the book. And Shooty said there are a lot of minor league teammates that were giving Glenn a hard time, that didn't like having a gay teammate. But even in that environment, Glenn earned so much respect by getting their paychecks from kind of a deadbeat owner of that minor league team who was always late with the paychecks, late with the meal money. And Glenn went into his office with a baseball bat and demanded the checks. And then Glenn, half an hour later, is passing them out in the clubhouse. But it was tough to be Black, tough to be gay in Ogden, Utah, when you're not going to get called up by the A's because the manager doesn't like you. And so it was during that 1980 season that he gave up baseball for good. And I think it's unfair to say that Glenn it was like his 100% his own choosing to leave baseball, or to retire. In some ways he was fed up with it and didn't want to have to deal with it anymore. But of course he would have preferred to be playing in the major leagues, then he was driven from the game more so than, a voluntary retirement, I would say.
In hindsight, with how Glenn's baseball career turned out, and how it was stymied before it truly ever got off the ground like it could have. Do you think he would have been better served signing and playing in the NBA?
That's a good question. He said so, right? I think he told you that on his deathbed, that his one regret in life is he hadn't gone with basketball instead of baseball. There weren't any out gay NBA players at that time either. It might again have depended on who his coach was, or who the general manager was, who the key players were on the team that he might have played for. I think he told people that he decided to play baseball rather than basketball because baseball gave him a contract first. The Dodgers showed up at his house after having drafted him. He wasn't drafted in the NBA. He never fully went through with some tryout offers that he had in the NBA. But, in general, I think of basketball, because of the Black influence in the game, probably would have been a more supportive environment for him. Careers are short there too, though. So, I just hesitate to say he would have been a great NBA player. You don't know, but he certainly had the athleticism. I think he might have been better off even on some different franchises in baseball.
Right.
I think Lasorda and Billy Martin, if you had to pick which managers he probably shouldn't play for, would be those two. If you had to pick who are the strongest outfields in that period, it's probably the Dodgers and the A's, so he would have had more ability to play in other spots, I think, even in Major League Baseball.
Yeah, I always thought from that period that a Chuck Tanner or a Sparky Anderson, they would have been better fits.
Yeah.
So Glenn passed away in 1995 in the home of his sister, Lutha. Do you think Glenn would have been surprised to see not one, but two authors on a video Zoom 26 years after his death, talking about his life like you and I are today?
I have to believe he would, right?
Of course.
Yeah. And I think it's one thing that I heard or read, my last book was about basketball in the Olympics in the in Nazi Germany. And I was reading a lot about Elie Wiesel for that book, the Holocaust survivor and the Nobel Peace Prize winner. And there was a book that was written by one of his sort of disciples in the United States who had been a student of his and became a professor. And they were talking about the fact that, these Holocaust survivors aren't going to be around forever,
Right.
and how important it is to hear their stories now. And Elie Wiesel said, well, that he himself had been a witness, but everybody who hears his story becomes a witness too, and then it's their obligation to keep these stories alive. And so I feel like, you were Glenn's witness, sitting there on his deathbed, recording his story before it was too late to get it, and then 25 years later, another person comes along that's interested in hearing your story about Glenn and digging into Glenn's story. And so then I become a witness too, right? Even though I
Yeah.
never had a chance to meet Glenn. And then people who read either one of our books become witnesses to Glenn's story also. And hopefully that understanding they have of Glenn's life and the context around it, and just this idea of empathy and giving people a chance to be who they want to be. I think books have that ability to sort of impart that knowledge or that mindset or that empathy. And so then everybody, the thousands of people hopefully who read our books, become witnesses to Glenn's life too. And so, yeah, that probably would surprise him. But I think in some ways that's the way it's supposed to go. When you have these important people who have had such courage and have inspiring and tragic stories in a way, you don't want those stories to be lost to history. So yeah, I think it would be surprising, but I'm glad it's happening.
Well, last question. Would he have been pleased with where society is today in terms of how it views gay rights?
That's a great question too. I mean, in some ways, things have changed so remarkably for the better since his lifetime. Where you have openly gay people running for president now. Where when you talk to, or let's say when Tom Brenneman made his remarks during the Reds game last year, you saw the reaction to that. Where he was out of a job, where you saw a lot of major league players saying that was unacceptable. And willing to talk about that. Where you have Billy Beane working for Major League Baseball, trying to make the situation better for players. Every franchise in sports has a pride night, which is one step. It's basically symbolic in a way to sell tickets, so it's not enough, but it's certainly teams not hiding from the issue. They're embracing it in some ways that they haven't before. On the other hand, what I think probably would have surprised Glenn is there hasn't been an out player since him, and especially that there hasn't been a player who's current, an active player in the major leagues to come out. And so I think things have been slower there than I imagine he would have thought. If he's saying as he's dying, he hopes his experience has made life easier for somebody in the future, to think that here we are 26 years later now, and there still hasn't been someone to walk through that door as they're playing, says a lot about the environment that the gay players who are in the major leagues right now but are closeted, are concerned about what the reaction might be, I imagine. And so in that way, things haven't gone far enough.
I totally agree. In fact, I did an interview with MSNBC. I want to say it was 2014 during the All-Star break when they honored Glenn. It's 2014, 2015. I think it was 14. Now that's 6 or 7 years ago. And I had said in that interview that I believed that within the next 2 or 3 years, you'd have an out player in the major leagues. And yeah, that has not happened. I was wrong, and it is surprising. And so, you would hope that with all the strides that have been taken, that there aren't, players out there really suffering like Glenn did.
Right. Yeah. You've seen it like trickles of it. Women's sports have come further than men's sports in that way. And then you've seen players like Michael Sam or Jason Collins in football, in basketball. But then you look at, like, say, a case of a Colin Kaepernick, where people who are standing up on social issues can have their careers taken away from them by ownership. And so I think players are just unsure what the reaction is going to be. I think that there would be, if with the right team, it could be the biggest positive story that there is. And I think that there could be a lot of marketing opportunities that come with it. This person could be on a lot of commercials and making a lot of money. When I talked to Billy Bean, he did bring up the financial aspect to this, though. And he said that a lot of players, they look at the window that they have as a professional athlete is going to be short anyway. And why risk it? Make your money now while you can. If you want to come out after your playing days, a lot of players would see that as a much safer route to go. And so you have to factor that in.
Well, the book is singled out and will be released on March 2nd, right?
That's right.
This is a great, great book. Glenn would be so proud, as am I, in keeping Glenn Burke's flame alive. And I'm sure up in heaven, he's giving Junior Gilliam a high five over this. Andrew, it was a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you for taking some time this morning, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you so much, Erik. I sort of consider you the godfather of this book, and it means a lot to me to have done this interview with you, and look forward to seeing you again, hopefully at a stadium. I want to get out to a baseball stadium again, a major league game, and best of luck with your own book that's coming out soon too. I can't wait to read that one and to watch your interview on the pandemic podcast about your own new book coming out soon.
Thank you again, Andrew.
All right, take care.